I just started recording, so we are good to go. For the few of you that don't know us quite yet, this is our, oh gosh, I don't know, I lost count, maybe 7th or 8th Wednesday night Wine Wednesday webinar that we've been doing since we've all been on lockdown. I'm Nicole Ramos with Florida Wine Academy as the host, and we have been doing the webinars in addition to our certification courses just to keep everybody involved, and it's been very meaningful to us that everybody keeps coming back. And so a few weeks ago, I connected with Mark to see how we could collaborate, because you know there's a lot of options out there. There are a lot of places you can go for your wine entertainment and educational sources. And for people that continue to come back to us, we just, you know, we appreciate it. So we don't want to just say it. We want to continue offering you reasons to come back and new things to learn. And I think one thing that you said initially, Mark, that was really interesting to me is that a lot of times people just see Australia as one place. So the wines are kind of coming from one place, or they just don't realize how diverse it is. And I love that part of the presentation that you're going to come to in just a little bit, to really highlight the diversity that's there. And so we decided to kind of do just the wines of Australia, an introduction, give a little bit of history, an overview, so that, you know, hopefully at the end of the session, you have a whole list of wine regions and varietals that you want to try. And so, yeah, pleasure to have you all. And Mark Davidson, Head of Education for Wine Australia here in the Americas. So awesome to have you.
Oh, pleasure, absolute pleasure. I'm thrilled to be able to do this and talk about one of my favorite subjects. Well, wine being my favorite subject, and Australian wine specifically. So yeah, great. I might just give a bit of background on what I do, or what I've done, just to sort of set the stage, because I do come from a hospitality background mostly. So while I work for a wine marketing and promotion agency, that's not kind of my background. I come more from the sommelier side of things. I was a sommelier back before they knew what that term meant. Someone said, "Oh, you're from So you're from West Africa?" I said, "No, that's Somalia." I work as a sommelier. Back in the day, people didn't understand. So very much a fan of wine education. I've been involved in education in wine specifically since 1990, when I set up my wine school in Vancouver. Went through all the WSET programs, worked for the International Sommelier Guild, helped develop that curriculum. I was in the MW program for a few years. I passed the tasting, didn't pass the theory, and then life changes and you just think, okay, I can't. I have to pick up some other books to read other than wine books. So I haven't gone back to that. But I'm writing a book, which I've been commissioned to write the book of Wines of Australia for Classic Wine Library. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. I'm supposed to be there now doing some research, but obviously that's not happening. So the publication date's going to be pushed back a little bit, but thrilled to be able to do that. And it's nice to have spent the last sort of 10 years quite sort of intimately focused on Australia, to then actually sort of pull that all together into a book is an exciting project. But for today, we're going to get stuck into Australia. I'm going to sort of share the screen here, and hopefully that's up. Hopefully everyone can see that. I'm not monitoring the questions right now.
I can.
I might leave that to you, Nicole. You can, yeah, just keep that going, and then I'll hopefully everyone can see. If there's anyone that can't, let me know, and hopefully that's working. You can see.
Presentation? Just give us a hands up. Okay, it's perfect.
Awesome.
So
Good.
that's all we need to hear. Thank you, Mary. Good.
Awesome. And Mary, Sydney, I love it. Crack of dawn there, having some coffee and learning about Australia. That's great. I'm really pretty pleased. Okay, so what we're going to do today, I'm going to quickly explain what Australian Wine Discovered is to you guys, because it's our free education website, which is essentially where I've sourced all this, all the PowerPoint presentations, and I'll go through that briefly with you. Talk about a bit about the history of grape growing and winemaking in Australia, sort of an overview of the climate and soils, just a bit of a background, just to make sure we understand, because I do think that there's some information out there about Australia, or some impressions about Australia, I should say, that I think are not necessarily accurate. I understand why people think that way, because of how wine from Australia has been presented to them, but it's just not quite as accurate as it probably should be in some cases. Some of the labelling laws, I'm going to skip through that. It's up there on the presentation, which of course I'll make available. You guys can have the presentation, more just for the geeky sort of study factors about labelling laws and geographic indications. And then we're going to kind of work our way through the key varieties in Australia, and some of the best sort of the sort of try and get a handle on the best regional expressions and styles of those varieties. With over 100 commercially viable varieties in Australia that are in the ground, 65 different regions. We're not covering it all today. It's that's not quite going to happen, but we'll do the best we can. Quick look at this. If you guys haven't been to this site, please do so. It's Australian Wine Discovered, and it's our education site. Very quickly, all of the information from today, I've basically pulled from the site. When you get into the site, it's essentially grouped into all sorts of categories of, right now there's 25 major topics on there, broken down varietally, regionally, and then sort of topical things that are of interest, like old vines and other sort of key topics. And they've got presentations attached to them, all of which are downloadable, editable, do what you want with them. So it's not this sort of protected site where you have to sort of pay to get in and only use the presentations the way they're set. You can just chop and change and use what you want. It's a really cool resource, especially if you're a student, obviously, but if you're working in the trade and might be doing a presentation, you can just literally pull out a slide and do, you know, one particular thing, which I think is kind of cool. So take some time after the presentation and have a look at this when you've got, you know, some time on your hands, which we all do right now. So anyway, I've just wanted you to see that and understand that that's a free resource for you. Now, if you need a translator, Nicole, you can translate for me. If there's any sort of colloquialisms that people don't understand what I'm saying, but
I'll do my best. I'll do my best.
Mad Max, when Mad Max first came to the US, they subtitled it.
Oh, really?
Back in the day, nobody understood what nobody understood what everyone was saying. We all laughed in Australia and said, "Hey, they had to subtitle Mad Max when it went to Australia, went to the US the first time." But anyway, that's kind of funny. So I'm not going to be subtitled tonight, but if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to stop me. I'm not going to go through all these PowerPoint slides line by line, but we'll just sort of, you know, giving you a bit of an understanding of the look and feel of our presentations, but also a nice timeline here. But I think the critical thing here is that we have to go back to grapes did not exist in Australia. They had to be brought in, and they were brought in on the first fleet of, well, settlers, convicts, whatever. Everyone likes to make a big deal of it. It's just terminology, really.
We'll just get it out there.
They're all petty crimes. It was minor, except Tasmanians. The ones that went to Tasmania were more serious. But anyway, it was a colony that was founded on that in the early days. But wine became an important piece of the puzzle. First grapes ended up going down to Australia in 1788 with the first fleet. I think the more important piece of that historical viticulture puzzle would be a little bit later when a Scottish botanist who was down in Australia went back to Europe and collected all the vine species that he could on a trip in the 1830s, critical time point there. He's not the only person. There were other pioneers of bringing grapes in, but he was more systematic. He went back over and went to the best places on the planet at the time, France, on the way back through South Africa, picked up varieties that were important at the time. And the records show that something like 360, 380 vines survived what in those days was a harrowing journey. He planted them. If you've been to Sydney, I know that, is it Hannah that's in Sydney right now? Right next to the Opera House there in the Botanical Gardens. That's where he replanted those original vine varieties and labeled them, did a duplicate cuttings and took them up to another thing. And that's really formed the foundation of all the great vine material. Why it's really cool is that if you, as students, you all know that when phylloxera hit, which was 1860, either in Provence or Lirac, depending on the text you read, all of those vines that Busby collected was pre-phylloxera. So all the vines that originally came over, and some of the parentage of which can trace their, no pun intended, their roots back to the original cuttings, were all pre-phylloxera. So right now, what that gives Australia in upwards of about 10 or 15 different varieties, some of the oldest ungrafted, own-rooted varieties anywhere on the planet. One of which is this. I just happen to have this just to tease you. It's not what I'm going to drink tonight. But that's the oldest Shiraz vineyard on the planet. That's the Freedom Vineyard, planted in 1843. And since we're looking at a Barossa Shiraz, that's the oldest Shiraz vineyard anywhere on the planet, still producing wine now 100 and however many years later, which I think is pretty remarkable and pretty cool. So we now have French viticulturists coming back to Australia to look at some of that original vine material and trying to get access to it, which we think is kind of humorous. It's like kind of selling ice to the Eskimos, but there you go. But anyway, that's the foundation of really old vine material, and that's an important piece of the puzzle in terms of just that qualitative discussion where people don't think of that. They think, oh, young, fresh, fruity wines from Australia. Actually, some of the oldest vineyard sites on the planet for classic varieties, they exist in Australia ungrafted old original rootstock is, because of phylloxera that doesn't exist in many other places of the world. There's certainly not lovely little pockets. Then you can look at this at your leisure, different sort of time, different ages through which wine was consumed. We had a period of fortified wines actually through the early 1900s till about the 60s. Australia was a big fortified wine producing country, largely because as a colony we were sort of told to make fortifieds. They were popular at the time, so there's some really excellent sherry styles, which we don't call them sherries anymore, and port style wines, the legacy of which means we've got these amazing, we've got some really good old material in barrels, especially tawny style ports. And there's a wonderful story, which is for another time, obviously a fortified story, and you may deal with the Rutherglen Muscats and some of the tawnies that you talk about in the maybe diploma level, advanced than diploma level. But Seppeltsfield is a place where you can go today and taste what was, I just think, absolute genius on behalf of the owner of Seppelt, Benno Seppelt, back in 1878. He said, we will lay down one barrel of this wine and it's not to be released for 100 years. And they've done that since 1878. So you can go in there today and the current release in May, which is right about now, will be 1920. That's the current release that's going to be coming out.
And these are all done in like a Connie style port way, you said.
They are effectively vintage, they're colliers, if you like. They're vintage dated tawnies, effectively. We don't call them that, but that's what they are. And it's always a pleasure to go down whenever I take people down to trips to Australia. We end up at Seppeltsfield and you get to try your birth year. And what I like most about it is most of these kids are younger than me, and my wine, my birth year is far more complex and far more interesting than all these youthful kids. It's the only benefit I get. But anyway, that's a side sort of thing. But the fortified era was an important piece of the puzzle, and we have a legacy of that. And then also what we've got now, there was a big shift after the World Wars. Troops coming back with different ideas about food and wine, and essentially coming back with, now we should be really focused on more table wines, and that's when it shifted a little bit. So some of the key points about this is sort of broken down on this slide here. So yeah, I think it's a really really interesting. We've got a history and legacy of fine wine production, and yet I don't know, probably being wine students, most of the people on the webinar today maybe are more aware of the quality and character of individually, regionally expressive wines in Australia. But there's still a lot of people that think, oh yeah, I know Yellowtail and it's fresh and fruity, sunshine in the bottle, and when I want something serious, I'm going to go to some other country. I think that exists a bit. I think it's an old story, but the reality is that I think there's quite a lot of complexity and amazing wines of interest in Australia right now. And I say that as a wine lover, not just as Australian wine. I love the world of wine, and I think Australia's a really exciting country right now, in particular because of how it's evolving. And hopefully we capture a little bit of that as we chat through it here today. No questions so far.
So we did have one question about how the recent wildfires are going to have an impact.
Yep.
On
Great question. I knew that would come.
I saw that on the website before. There's like kind of a blog article about that, but if maybe you wanted to just
I'll say it really quickly, and certainly lucky is not the right word, because we've been hit by two amazingly complex things: the bushfires, part of which are normal in Australia. These ones were not normal. They were devastating and unprecedented. And then the pandemic, which is affecting everybody. It's been a rough year for Australia in general, but the Australian wine business specifically. There were some regions that got hit, but overall, the vineyard areas in Australia, I think it's about 1 to just a bit over 1% damage in actual vineyards overall. Now that's obviously a bit higher in some areas, like Adelaide Hills got hit to the tune of about maybe 15-20% of the vineyards got damaged or affected in some ways. So yeah, not to make light of anything to do with the bushfires, because it was awful, and there was a lot of people that did lose. I know some people that lost vineyard sites. As a producer friend of mine won't have a really cool access to one really cool vineyard site because it got destroyed. So overall, not too bad. We a lot of people can thank their lucky stars over that one. And but yeah, that was just an awful series. And bushfires are normal for anyone that's there's other areas that have fire prone areas, like if you live in California or some other places. We know in the Pacific Northwest recently it's been consistent, so people understand the nature of those changes in the environment. And there's a lot of talk about how to manage those and how to do things better in the future. And yeah, some of it's to do with backburning. When I was a kid, the forest used to be backburned. The Aborigines did it for tens of thousands of years. But they stopped that because it was too polluting. But I think there might be a reassessment of how those things are being done now. But overall, we've been fairly lucky. There's some damage to wines through smoke taint. There's going to be some of those issues that are still to be TBD. But overall, there's a few producers not making wine in this particular year, and others that have barely been touched by it. So yeah, the whole Hunter Valley, because of smoke, won't be making wine. So yeah, hopefully that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but yeah, so interesting.
Well, it sounds like it was, could have been far, far worse. Of course, terrible for the region of Hunter Valley, but the fact that, we saw the scale of devastation. So being able to say, all right, that was actually in the terms of like a smaller percentage of wine that were regions that were actually affected. It's good to hear.
Yeah, I think what we're still there's some numbers have to come in terms of the genuine effects. But I know, for example, the Hunter Valley will be like 80% of the wines won't be made, like so down to 20%, because essentially there was smoke in the region, hanging in the region for 80 days.
And there's
so
no
there's no recovering from that, because it's just like when you just have to hang out at a fire at a campfire and understand how things just permeate in and just the smoke itself. So yeah, so there is that, unfortunately. But and again, I don't have the updated statistics on that. I don't think they've been published yet, but yeah, we're keeping on top of it. But it is a fact of life for Australia, but certainly not something that we relish. But yeah, hopefully there's some strategies that can be employed to sort of minimize these things in the future. But climate change is the thing, right? It's happening. Things you have to manage.
Perfect.
Great. So 65 regions, or GIs as we call them. We're not going through them all. We're just going to look at the major varieties, the major styles coming out of those regional expressions. But here's something I do want to point out, and to sort of kind of set the stage for the size and scale in Australia. It's a big country. It's 4% smaller than the continental US. So take Hawaii and Alaska out of the equation. Australia fits neatly into the US. It's a big country, but it's spread out. And there's different, we're going to look at the climate and soils, but it's like, it's like going Perth to Sydney on this map. That's like LA to New York. It's a big country. So when people say to me, the two things I hear: what was the weather like in Australia in this vintage? Like, I don't know. What was the weather in the US like? It depends where you are. You can make generalizations, but certainly it's not that easy. And I also love I love Australia. I love the wines from that region. It's like, well, Australia's a country, and we've got lots of regions within it, and we've got to get there. Let's have a look at the size, though. So here's a really interesting map, somewhat scale map, to look at where we fit. There's a big geographic spread in Australia. So if you're looking at Margaret River wines, you're sort of west of Portugal. And if you're in the Hunter Valley, you're east of Bulgaria, all of which is in this sort of geographic spread. So it's long distances between places. So making generalizations is awkward. One thing for sure, we need to be in the south. We'll talk about the climate in a moment. We need to be in the southern areas, because north is too hot and too tropical. The south is, we need the things in Australia that are going to mitigate what would otherwise be a really warm climate. A lot of, the middle part of Australia is in the desert. And so that's obviously not suitable to viticulture, and the vast majority of the north is not suitable. So you've got to, sort of the vineyards areas are in the south. But the other thing too is, while we look at this, you think, wow, it's a big country. We produce a lot of wine. Actually, we don't. Here's the reality check. 135,000 hectares of area under vine. That's not insignificant. I'm not trying to say that's a small amount, but that's like Burgundy and Bordeaux combined, or another region in the south of France. It's about the same size as the Languedoc, which is not insignificant, but it's really not big if you consider the vineyard acreage in Spain or Italy or France, for that matter. So I think it's important to remember that while we have been known for these big brands, these successful wines that have been out in the marketplace, Australia is really not that big an area under vine. So interesting to know. Key things here is that we need, as I mentioned, you've got to be further south in Australia. And we'll look at some of the maps that show this. You can see the temperature ranges here. I just like putting colorful maps up. I'm going to have to follow them necessarily, but these are all available through the website and in the presentations. But bottom line is that closer to the ocean, cooler. Further south, cooler. There are some interesting currents that circulate around, so that Tasmania might look like it's the same sort of temperatures over here in Western Australia, but two different oceans over on the Perth side of things here. So slightly different water temperatures. But essentially our refrigeration unit in Australia is the Southern Ocean. So as you head down south here from Adelaide or Tasmania or wherever, next stop is Antarctica, and you might, if you go off course, bump into that other insignificant wine producing country. What's the name of it again? I can't actually say it. I think it's called New Zealand.
Yeah, some island kind of over there. Does that indicate that there's strong competition between you and the Kiwis?
Nah, they're insignificant. We don't care. No, actually, it's all a bit tongue in cheek. Actually, New Zealand. I love great wines from everywhere. New Zealand's been remarkable in nobody really knowing much about New Zealand wines in the 1990s to every single person on the planet. I mean, as a student, wouldn't you love to get a Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc as a blind tasting wine? It's just like a freebie, But everybody knows it, and it's amazing. And I all credit to the New Zealanders, and this from a insignificant country in the South Pacific, but whatever.
Won't tell them you said that.
Yeah, no, don't. So rainfall, we don't need to look at this. But again, these cooling things, there's three major things. There's other factors, but latitude, obviously, as I said, you've got to get further south. The two main things are that ocean breezes. That's what's going to cool down the temperatures to make it suitable for quality viticulture. And then there's altitude being the other thing. Look, we've done conversions for our American friends. Have you guys heard of the metric system?
Once or twice, for those of us that are lucky enough to travel, I actually used to think, I told temperature in Celsius when I was living in Germany for about 3.5 years, and I've just lost it. I have to convert. I don't use it anymore.
I grew up with, we switched when I was at school, and I grew up with it, and now I'm in the US going, I have to do these conversions. Anyway, you can see the differences here, but it is important. And it doesn't even seem like much when you're talking about altitude, but it has significant differences. And obviously, all things being equal, which they of course never are, but basically every 100 meters, or they're about 328 feet, you go up in elevation or altitude. It's 0.65 degrees Celsius overall temperature change, which, for example, valley floor somewhere or going up to Eden Valley, 400 meters above sea level, that's a few degrees of Celsius temperature difference, which is significant, meaning, certain varieties might not ripen very easily up there. Certain varieties will ripen easily, and they'll certainly ripen later in the growing, and they will, harvest times will be in cooler conditions. So it's just different. It's an important factor in Australia. There's a lot of sort of significant altitude vineyard sites in Australia. The mountain ranges, again, we'll talk a bit about. They do have a major impact in Australia. There's the thing called the Great Dividing Range, which is the shaded area here running down this eastern flank of Australia. A lot of the vineyard areas just in southern Queensland, there's some vineyard areas all the way through New South Wales, and the tip of these are sort of hit. This makes it look like it continues across. It sort of doesn't. It breaks up a little bit, but the bottom end of the Great Dividing Range is Yarra Valley, a famous area for Pinot and Chardonnay. Let's just take, for example, though, the Mount Lofty ranges here, which affect a whole bunch of regions that are well known to us: Barossa, McLaren Vale, Clare Valley, Adelaide Hills. Now, Mount Lofty ranges, because we are such an old, eroded country, which I'll get to in a moment, they used to be Everest in proportion, hundreds of thousands of meters high, but they're weathered, and they're now sit at the highest point of about 750 meters above sea level. If they didn't exist, Clare Valley, Eden Valley, Barossa, McLaren Vale, Adelaide Hills, they would not be wine regions. It would most likely be, as it is, a bit further west, ocean meets desert. So it's an important piece of the puzzle. The mountain ranges are a really important sort of capturing area, if you like, for weather systems and things that make agriculture in general suitable, and certainly specifically for viticulture. Great. Different climates. I won't spend time on this, but we've classified our climates, loosely into continental, Mediterranean, maritime. So we can, certain areas are affected by all of these, all of which you can look at your own time. And some are affected by both. To be brutally honest, there are some altitude vineyards that benefit from that elevation as well as some of the cooling breezes, but it just sort of depends. Like Tasmania might be an example of that. And then there's these more warmer maritime climate areas like Barossa, more, McLaren Vale being classic, sort of almost Mediterranean. In fact, when you're in McLaren Vale, there's olive groves. I was down there with a lovely master sommelier, one of the nicest industry people here in this country, a woman called Madeleine Trifon. She's a master sommelier, and she's from Greece originally, and she just was in McLaren Vale with me about this time last year, and she's like, my gosh, I feel like I'm in Greece right now. It just has that sort of Mediterranean feel to it. So that was kind of cool. It's a really, really nice reminder of that sense. So Another piece, maybe not so much a qualitative discussion, but certainly something worth understanding, is that Australia's been an individual landmass for over 100 million years. Some of the most ancient soils and ancient geological structures exist in Australia. So I always loved that whole old world, new world discussion, which when I got into wine was somewhat relevant based on style, but it's increasingly a less relevant way of understanding the wine world in terms of styles even. I mean, you taste, I don't know, we were just talking about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc and I don't know, Sancerre. They used to be worlds apart, and I don't know that they're worlds apart anymore. I think there's a lot more sort of similarities in terms of wine styles. But if we were to look geologically speaking, Europe is New World and Australia is Old World, and it's not even close. As I say, some of the oldest structures exist. Now, again, that's not qualitative in any way, shape, or form. It's just that there's a lot of things we don't understand about the soils, and that connection to wine style and wine quality and soil type is not as deeply explored as it is in Europe. For example, I used to do this job for Wine Australia globally, so I was traveling around the world, and I used to ask this question to everyone and anyone. I'd say, what is the most, is there a wine area in Australia that you can name that's inextricably connected to a soil type and a wine or a variety? And everyone says Coonawarra. One person said Heathcote, which I thought was interesting, but virtually everyone around the world says Coonawarra. So well done, Coonawarra, but they've got this very interesting strip of homogeneous terracotta soils. But that doesn't mean there aren't these amazingly specific soil types in parts of, the blue slate, 10 million year old blue slate soils in parts of Clare, and these wonderful old marine sediments in Heathcote. We just haven't explored it enough and haven't made that connection. That's what's been happening over the last 10 to 20 years, and people are more talking about it. Be it in McLaren Vale, there's all sorts of different geologies, and we're understanding that one subsection called Blewett Springs is really sandy. And what do we see in the wines? A beautiful aromatic presence and perfume coming through the Grenache and the Shiraz, but specifically Grenache. And so that's all starting to evolve and emerge, and I like that. I think that's the next few stages. But Burgundy was at it for a long time before they kind of separated it out and understood those individual appellations and sub-appellations, and then vineyard sites within that. So we'll get there. But I think it's just important to remember it's a really important piece of the puzzle.
I think it'll be really exciting for people to be able to start trying those kind of more like terroir-based wines, because people love Chablis for that minerality in the soil, and they love the Sancerre or the Pouilly-Fumé for the same reason. And and it's not just France, but we do kind of tend to think of that as that original old world.
Yeah, totally. And we don't even do it that well, I think, in terms of as wine students. We geek out about it in France, and rightly so. It's very, very detailed, and the way, certainly the appellations in Burgundy. But boy, where else do we like? You can Barolo, maybe Barbaresco, but you can go through all sorts of parts of Tuscany, and people are like, what? Oh, ask most students, what are the main soils in Brunello? And they'd have to go, oh, hang on, I better think. You don't have to think when you ask about Chablis, for example. So we've got a lot of work to do, and I think a lot of understanding. And the problem we've got in Australia too, much like, I don't know, Alsace, when we talk about Alsace, a patchwork quilt of all these different soil types, that's sort of the same from region to region in Australia. And never mind that within each region, they've identified 18 different sort of geological structures in McLaren Vale. It's not even that big. So, we'll get there. And I love it. I think it's awesome. Right now, I just want people to know where McLaren Vale is, because some people don't. And so just, the sub-regionality is awesome. And that's where my heart lies, and where I think the fun and the interest and the quality of expression lies. But, we got to get people to understand where these places exist and what the overall feel or look and feel of the places first. So, but cool stuff and really exciting. And I love that this is where they're going. And one of my friends is in the Yarra Valley, and he's a guy called Mac Forbes, Pinot and Chardonnay producer. He's managed to locate one of the elders from one of the original Aboriginal tribes that existed in that area, the Yarra, and he's trying to have some conversations about how they farmed and understood the agriculture on that land, to see if he can better understand his vineyard sites, which I think is interesting. I've never sort of expanded more with him. I never had a bigger discussion with him on that, but I think it's really cool.
Maybe who better to ask? It's kind of a source that they're just waiting. Ask me. I have knowledge.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's
right.
Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
Just that the soils, when we start getting into soils, can become kind of feel like kind of very wine geeky. So for those of you here who have not really given it much thought, yeah, I understand it can seem kind of like, why are we talking so much about soils? But one of our educators, Celeste, is a huge soil geek, and so she, you know, it's this part that needs to be explored and is kind of underappreciated, I guess, and under-recognized. So it's very exciting to hear that, you know, research and development is being devoted to
it's I think it's exciting too, and when I'm down there I'm always trying to understand it. And I think it's difficult too, because, you know, right now me being able to say, oh yeah, you can taste the, you know, the differences here, I think you can do it in certain places. And as I say, McLaren Vale, the sand grown Grenache, beautiful aromatics and perfume, you think, okay, I can see that. And the Grenache may be grown 2 kilometers down the road on these more clay-based soils, and you think, okay, yeah, that's got a bit more structure. It's a little different. So I love that. Labeling laws, I'll just leave that up there, and you know, we've got our labeling laws just like, you know, just like Napa has the AVA system in the US has, and France has. We just don't have the varietal, like, we've got to plant this, which I think in this day and age with climate change, we should be grateful that we are being told what we should and shouldn't plant.
And for anybody who maybe is just not quite sure, not familiar with GI or even AVA, it just it indicates like a delimited region that has specific, you know, characteristics that are more or less unique to that. So if you think about wines from Napa Valley compared to wines from the Willamette Valley in Oregon, and it's very strict in, you know, those old war countries in France, for example. The laws, it just really kind of defines what people, producers can and cannot do, where it's much less strict in countries like Australia than it is in France, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ever see GI or AVA in France, POC, those are basically indicating a region of production, and then the styles are indicated.
Absolutely, yeah, and there are you know, there are laws dictating what you can and can't do within that. But as I said, and you just reiterated that variety is not, it's not like, you know, you have to plant XYZ here. But if you've said something on your label, and that's what our organization does. There's paper trails, and there was a winery that made some, you know, things that recently were totally bad record keeping that had to have their license suspended. And it's like, okay, well, you know, we do that. There are stops and checks for making sure that label integrity is a really important piece of the puzzle for us in Australia. What's in your bottle has to be absolutely accurate.
Sure, because if you don't want to mislead your consumers at exactly the time when you want to grow your markets.
Totally, yeah. So there's GIs, zonal, regional, sub-regional. Again, I'll leave this if you, and certainly I'll leave my email address. Anyone that wants to follow up with me, I'm happy to do so. I don't think we want to get bogged down speaking too much about this. But let's get into some of the prominent regions. So yeah, it's a difficult one. Certainly when we're pulling together the education elements, it's, you know, you've got to kind of think, where in the world are people going to get access to some of these wines? And are we going to have a regional module or talk a lot about the wines from Peracuta, for example, which no one's ever heard of and never seen the wines because they barely make it out of their own region. So we just looked at the major regions, and I'd say that's a fairly good sort of cross-section of the prominent regions that you're most likely to come across wherever you might be on the planet. I just had wines from Orange sent to me. There's a new producer in the US, and had some wine sent to me from there, which was nice for me to see that we're getting some of that. But for the most part, we're seeing a lot of Barossa, Adelaide Hills, Coonawarra, and those sorts of wines. And that's why a lot of our education is focused on those major areas. So what I've got to do is that the first wine I think that anyone might try, if they've got that Jansz sparkling, we're going to look at that in a moment, but I might just quickly go through Australian Chardonnay and Pinot, simply because that's what this wine's made out of, the Rosé is. Talking a bit about that, and we'll finish with Tasmania and looking at Chardonnay and Pinot grown there. How does that sound? Okay, so Chardonnay, it's really is one of Australia's classic whites. It's the most planted white variety there. And I think what the evolution, I'd say, for all the classic varieties in Australia, the evolution of this particular variety in terms of the style of wines being produced in the best regions right now is it's unrecognizable from 15 years ago. And I think the original style was big, oaky, extracted, much like California was doing in the 80s as well. I think there are a lot of parallels. Flavor was all important, structural complexity, maybe not so much. And then we all got a bit tired of them. I used to love those big oaky Chardonnays from California. It's basically pulling splinters out of your teeth. They were so oaky. But the reality is that they do get a bit tiresome to drink, and you want a bit more refreshment value. And I think that evolution in Australia has been really cool. A good way to maybe look at it is we've got oaked, unoaked, and sparkling styles of Chardonnay in Australia. It's not quite that easy because, I mean, they're grown. One of the lovely things that you've probably learned as a student about Chardonnay is that viticulturally, it's a very easy variety to grow compared to other varieties. It's quite adaptable to warm and cool climates. You can make suitably interesting wine in all of them. Generally speaking, the better examples come from sort of more moderate or cool climates like Chablis and other parts of Burgundy. But the reality is that because it's a friendly variety, you can grow it in all sorts of different styles, or you can make it in all sorts of different styles. I think the unoaked business with Chardonnay came about of people just being tired. That was that anything but Chardonnay phase that people went through, which was, I'm so tired of these big oaky wines. Which I think is an interesting stage, and I still think that refreshment value you can get from an easy drinking unoaked Chardonnay is great. People say, oh, Chablis unoaked. Actually, most of the very best Chardonnays see some oak. It's just not new oak. I like wood and Chardonnay. It's got to be very carefully done. And I think the evolution in Australia right now has been more about oak that is background noise and not the full-on rock and roll up front. It should be just sort of background noise. And I think that's a really cool thing. And a lot of that's to do with Chardonnay being grown in cooler areas or moderate to cooler areas. Therefore, the fruit profile doesn't allow you to put too much oak in. All you just taste is oak. And then, of course, it's a wonderful variety, as we know. I mean, one of my favorite styles of champagne is Blanc de Blanc, 100% Chardonnay. I love how Chardonnay evolves as a base for sparkling wine, and that's what you'll see a bit in the bubbles here when we get there in a moment. Yeah, so there's all sorts of things, and I think the key regions, it's grown, and it's the most planted white variety in Australia, so it's grown everywhere. So we're not doing disservice to other regions where good Chardonnay exists. There's great Chardonnays from so many areas, but I think when push comes to shove, these would be 6 sort of top areas right now. Adelaide Hills, Hunter Valley is the original sort of warmer zone. Margaret River, probably one of the most, awarded, the regions that has the most awarded Chardonnays over the last 20 years. Mornington Peninsula, influenced by the cooler Southern Ocean there. Tasmania and Yarra Valley, and we'll talk a bit about Tasmania in the bubbles, but I'm going to have a look. Has anyone got any questions? I'm sort of running along here. I'm not stopping to see.
Yeah, please feel free. I'll keep an eye out, and I can always, throw them to Mark.
Cool. So yeah, and just to look around, a lot of these regions end up. So what we talked about was Adelaide Hills up here in the hills around Adelaide, hence the name. Down here in the south, Mornington Peninsula, Tasmania, Yarra Valley, all affected by those cooling breezes from the Southern Ocean. Hunter Valley, original sort of Chardonnay producing. In fact, the oldest Chardonnay vineyard on the planet exists there, planted in 1908 or 1910, I can't remember, but still was planted there, and Tyrrell's actually owns it. So that was an interesting story. And then Margaret River over here on the west coast, affected by the dual influences of the Southern Ocean coming up from the south and the Indian Ocean, which is a little bit warmer. So it's a more moderate climate rather than, couldn't say cool climate, but definitely affected by the ocean breezes. Quick look at Pinot. I got into wine because of Pinot. I am an absolute Pinot lover. I was learning about wine while working in a restaurant and was tasting wines. We were buying wines out of a cellar this owner let us do, and we're tasting Bordeaux. And then one day we just tried a Von Romanet from, a Chambord-Musigny. And I was like, what the heck is this? And why is it? It actually makes me feel something rather than just, I like it. And I've been fascinated by number 1 Burgundy, red Burgundy. It's always been, especially Chambord-Musigny, which is my favorite commune, but also just Pinot in general. I just love its flexibility as a sommelier and as a wine and food lover. I just think you can have it with so many things. I love Pinot Noir, but it is a bit of a difficult variety. And I think even though the original vines for Pinot Noir came to Australia in the Busby collection, Australia was not known in the early days for Pinot Noir. It took a long time for it to figure out where it belongs in Australia, how to handle it when it is in those regions, and getting access to some new clones and playing around with how to grow it. And there was a book written many years ago called The Heartbreak Grape, and it was about Calera winery in California, talking a bit about just what a difficult variety it is compared to some other varieties. I mean, people know how to handle it now, but it's always considered this fickle variety. It's a bit like, looking at how to grow Pinot is a bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It's not too much of this, and then when it's all fussy when you get it into the winery. Everyone argues about how whole cluster and how much oak, and so it's just a finicky variety. But when it's good, oh man, that is the there's just something beautiful about the structure and the aromatics about Pinot Noir that I love. And I think Australia's in a lovely place with Pinot Noir. In the cooler zones is the important piece of the puzzle for Australia. And I've actually been lucky or unlucky enough to be around long enough to watch the evolution of Pinot Noir in California and Oregon in the early days. And frankly, most countries that have said, okay, we're going to start making some good Pinot, it doesn't happen straight away. It's always something that's it's deep. I remember some of the awful, dreadful wines I had in California in the day. Certainly not the case now. A lot of early Oregon, save for Irie and a few others, was sort of problematic in the early days until just trying to get a handle on how to grow it and what to do in the winery once you do manage to find the right sites for it. And I think we're in a nice place now in Australia where even 15, 20 years ago, you'd say, oh, maybe try this Pinot or that Pinot. Now it's like, knock yourself out. There's so much good Pinot coming from various areas. But looking at the regions, I would always say, look at the regional expressions, and those four right there, I think it's pretty safe to say you'll find some pretty good stuff there. Yarra Valley may be leading the charge in terms of having the history and reputation now with Pinot. Tasmania, I think the word Tasmania is just, we're going to talk about this in a moment. There's something about you Americans, you love it. It's the Bugs Bunny cartoon. I know it's the Bugs Bunny cartoon, but there's something about Tasmania that is just like very, very fascinating. And I was there about this time last year with a group, and it is a magnificent place. I do love it. It's very different from a lot of other parts of Australia, sort of green and lush, but it's cool sort of lushness, not sort of tropical lushness, but definitely it's got almost an English sort of feel to it. Mornington Peninsula, also known for fantastic Pinot Noir, and in Adelaide Hills, which is in a warmer state of South Australia, but the elevation there. So ocean breezes here, a bit of ocean breeze, but mostly elevation here, ocean here, and elevation there. They're the things that you need to make it work for good Pinot.
Yeah. It's almost as if the grape is playing a little bit hard to get.
Totally agree.
What you want, but you really have to know. You have to try. You have to bring it gifts. You have to, plead with it. Right. So, yeah.
And it's so funny too, because I always try and come from a standpoint with any wine. Whenever I pick up a wine I don't know enough, I always look for the good in it first and foremost. And if I find something, I don't go, oh, what's wrong with this wine? That's why some of my winemaker friends, I hate tasting with them because they're always looking for fault first thing. I come from the other angle. I come from what's beautiful about this wine. Sometimes you got to say, no, this is not a good wine.
Sure.
But with Pinot, maybe it's because it was my first love. I just always make excuses for even ordinary Pinot. I don't know. It's like, yeah, it's not very nice. It's like, but it's still tasty, sort of. I just love it. But it does get under your skin. There's no question about it. There's no question. I'm probably more critical of Cabernet than I'm of Pinot. So anyway, there's literally great Pinot grown in many, many parts of Australia, but all of which it's got to be cool. There's very few areas that are producing, I think, world-class Pinot in warm zones in Australia. It's all about that balance and having that cooling influence to really bring out those lovely aromatics. And I think the interesting thing is that I think when people think Australia, they think it is warm there. I know Shiraz, they're big and full bodied. Therefore, the Pinots must be, and they're not. They're genuine, cool climate, delicate, light to medium bodied wines with very delicate flavors and aromas. And it's a bit of a shock to people initially. But I think it's a lovely place to experiment with. If you want really good food-friendly wines, Pinots from Yarra or Adelaide Hills, it's pretty cool.
We're going to have to get some more Australian Pinots on the 305 website. Now, Alessandro actually has a great question. If you compare Australian Pinot with New Zealand Pinot.
New Zealand, never heard of it. Where's
that? that rogue island nation.
No, a very, very good question. And I think what is so lovely about New Zealand is the image. We all know that New Zealand's got mountains and cool ocean breezes, but the interesting thing is that if you look at, say, one of the maybe Martinborough and Marlborough, because I think those wines that tend to be along that more medium bodied. But look at Otago. We know Otago is a brilliant area for Pinot Noir, but those are not light-bodied wines. That is a semi-arid desert in Otago. The wines are actually quite structured. Beautiful wines, and it's not a criticism, but they're a little bit more muscular and a bit more full-bodied. And I know I was at an event where a Pinot Noir from Macedon ranges in Australia was side-by-side being poured with Felton Road. And I said to one of my friends, go and have a look there. We all think cool climate, New Zealand. Come back and tell me which wine seems more cool climate to you. And I said, well, no question. The Aussie wine was just more light-bodied and more structured and different, and beautiful wines from Otago. And it's not a criticism, but I do think that as a comparison, I think that there are quite a lot of similarities, But I would argue that in some of the genuine cooler climate zones, those wines will come across as lighter and more medium-bodied than, say, wines from Otago. So beautiful. So this is a real hotbed of Pinot production. This little circle around Melbourne, Yarra, Mornington, Geelong, and this place called Macedon Ranges. So that's kind of a really cool little spot. But then we've also got the sparkling wine discussion for Pinot and Chardonnay, which is what's gone into your first wine. So I'll do a quick little look at sparkling wine production in Australia, and then we'll look at Tasmania. Lots of sparkling wine, and Tasmania was originally noted as being a sparkling wine producing region simply because it was cooler, and it was, these are the sorts of acid structures we want in, to form the backbone of good sparkling wines. Chardonnay and Pinot were planted, and consequently that is the source for some of the best base of sparkling wines that we find in Australia. But it's also really cool for table wines, good Chardonnays and Pinots. Different styles. I do, with Adelaide Hills, Yarra Valley, there's Rosés, Brut, dry styles, but there's also this lovely little thing down here in the corner, sparkling Shiraz, which is a little bit of a freak show to most people. I don't know if there's anyone in the group that's had a good sparkling Shiraz. I used to kind of...
Story about it. Sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Alessandra.
No. Oh, she does? Good. I'd love to hear it. I have a bit of a story simply because I was living and working in a restaurant in Vancouver, British Columbia for many years, and I wasn't a huge fan of Australian Shiraz until the Australian Wine Society came out and they wanted to do a dinner, and that was the first course wine. And I was like, oh gosh, really? And so I just thought, well, where else are we doing table sparkling red wines? Well, we've got the Emilia Romagna. What's the cuisine there? And I ended up coming up with a salad with a smoked goose breast on it, and started to really understand the inherent beauty of sparkling Shiraz and its flexibility with food. And one of the great matches I found is, well, I accidentally had it for breakfast with eggs Benedict, which was good, at least I think, but that's another story. Peking duck. Okay. Peking duck and sparkling Shiraz is a brilliant combination. It's also good Thanksgiving wine. But yeah, Alessandra's got a good story. That's interesting.
Yeah, she studied it. She knew the theory, and yeah, she got it right. And I can't quote the story word for word. Alessandra can definitely correct me in any area that I'm wrong here. But I think a lot of people had not been anticipating the possibility of that. You have to be prepared for everything. And because she was living in Guatemala at the time and not able to actually taste a lot of these wines, I'm sure it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find sparkling Shiraz in Guatemala. She knew the theory, and she went in with the theory. And I think that's a great, story for any student. If you can't get the wine, know the theory.
I totally agree with that. That's actually really cool. That's a good story. I did that in the MW exam. I got a sparkling Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. I'd never had one before, but it smelled like Sauvignon Blanc. It was sparkling, and I guess it must be that.
Okay, love that.
Okay, Tasmania. So your wine, I couldn't get access to the Rosé, but this is the Jansz that for the people that did buy it, it's the same company. Jansz was, this is the vintage label, which I think there's only about a half a dozen 6-packs that come into the country. But that's the vintage dated wine. And, but the Rosé, I love that. And my wife works for that company that imports that. So she gets, staff discount on that one. And we drink a fair bit of the Jansz Rosé, which I love. And I do think stylistically, the price is fantastic. I think the style is just so typical Tasmanian, which is, there's a nice texture to that wine, but there's just this beautiful, vibrant acidity, and there's almost like a lemon sherbet kind of quality to it. I always tend to get out of Pinot Noir there, and also a little bit in the sparkling wines, almost like a slight red apple kind of a quality to it. So that's Pinot. I'll pull up in a moment, but yeah, so the fruit is sourced in this particular case for this particular wine. You get a bit of a sense of how the look and feel. That's in the Tamar River Valley. Some of the fruit from the Jansz was sourced here, but it's from up here in the Tamar and Pipers River, and a little bit from down south, or Coal River, which is a little bit further south. But realistically, this is not really a vineyard site sort of specific wine. It's more about a style, and they're sourcing it from vineyards across Tasmania. But it does give you a good sense of Tasmania. I'll show you that in a moment. But this is the wine, 78% Pinot, 22% Chardonnay, different vineyard sources. A little bit of elevation is important to this. Hand-picked, whole bunch pressed. They just pressed it, very gentle. Goes through a full malolactic, which I'm sure you guys have covered a little bit. And then it's 24 months on lees before being disgorged. So it's following along a sort of a similar sort of trajectory of non-vintage champagne style wine.
Yeah, no, and I think that's why, you know, we have a lot of loyal fans of the Jansz here in the
That's
room,
so good.
and in as our, you know, regular 305 clients as well, because when people see the price point, and I think it's about $23, and taste it. So for those of you tasting along at home, if it's your first time trying it, enjoy. I'm very happy for you. If you're tasting it again like I am, it's good to be back. But you know, it's with having so much Pinot, you get, of course it's rosé, you expect a little bit of red fruits, but it's really just like pure like cherry and blossoms and white flower, and there's a little bit of that like orange zest. It's really complex, and for anybody that's maybe not quite sure about that kind of more traditional style, essentially it's like that champagne method, traditional method, champenois, so that second fermentation takes place in the bottle, and that means, you know, it's a little bit more work. You actually could pay more money for something that, you know, had this much love into it. Totally. And it's such a wonderful value wine for that. And then on top of that, spending 24 months on the lees, so resting in bottle before, you know, it goes through the final phases and out to market, it's quite a long time for somebody to take care of your wine, and it's such a beautiful product and great price point. So.
Yeah, great. Yeah, really cool points. And yeah, it is a lovely wine. And there's just something about, I think there's something about pink. It just makes you want to drink it anyway. Lovely.
It's a happy color, you know.
It sure is.
There are people in here who aren't rosé fans yet. Email me, we'll talk about it. But I think, yeah, it's something you see. It's so pretty, and it's almost like delicate and more than that at the same time. It's
persistent. There's good persistence on that, but the initial impression of that one is very much about vibrancy, and I like that, because that juicy, fresh sort of quality is it's what you would expect. It's cool. It's cool climate in Tasmania, as I said. Like next up there is Antarctica to the south, so it's cool climate there.
Yeah. It's producing really beautiful wine. So this was my first Tasmanian wine, so I think I was incredibly lucky to have been introduced to this, and we tell as many people that will listen to about how delicious it is. It's just such a great quality wine, and to think about this island off of Australia that people probably do not think of as producing wine, you can't forget it. You know, once you know it, it's never going to be off your radar.
Well, they jokingly, when you're at, because Yalumba owns, the Yalumba winery owns Jansz, and when you're tasting with them, they call it method Tasmanoise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Alessandra had just made the comment there. So it's their own take on it, kind of in the Cap Classique in South Africa, I think. But
they're about to switch too, because my wife was just explaining to me that they're actually building a winery on site. The wine isn't made at the winery. They've got vineyard sources, and it's made elsewhere, but they're actually building a winery on site. So.
Okay, that's exciting.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's very exciting. Oh, and there's a little Tasmanian devil.
Yes.
This is the point at which they're still quite cute and not so aggressive, and then they start sort of crunching through bones and things as they become they're not very big. They're actually kind of like, when they get to full size, they're not they're big, but they're quite they're not it's not an animal you can pick up once they're after about a year old. This was at a sanctuary where they've had some issues. The Tasmanian devils have had some facial cancer issues that have been wiping them out, so they're trying to get the research right so they don't become extinct. But yeah, interesting little critters though. They've they don't spin around.
When I first learned that, I was very disappointed. I think
I'm sure you were.
You just picture it, but they are kind of a little bit, aggressive, I guess. Or is it just more like kind of a raccoon? When it wants its food, it's going to do whatever it wants?
No, they're a bit more aggressive than a raccoon. Raccoons can be a bit aggressive. Yeah, when we were at this wildlife sanctuary here, and the guide knew we were coming. We had some American guys and girls coming in, and he said, "Great." So he showed us this, pulled this out of a little bag, and said, "Oh, like, whoa, that's kind of weird." And then he saved, and he pulled out some bones and stuff to give to the adult ones. And he was saying that I think pound for pound, their jaw pressure is 10 times that of a saltwater crocodile. and they were just crunching through bones. Like they're just these tiny little animals, and they crunch right through big bones. And you're like, well, okay, yeah, definitely don't want to get in the wrong side of one of them. But they are small; they're not massive animals, but they're unique. I mean, Australia's been separated for such a long time. We've got all these weird-looking animals,
We sure do.
kangaroos that bounce, a platypus that looks like somebody patchworked it together in a craft class, and so.
Yeah, that's the biggest draw. It's the wine and it's the wildlife. I think that's fascinating. Yeah, so
Totally.
Anybody who's tasting along at home with the Jansz before we move on to Riesling, any comments? I know, Carlos, you were excited to hear about Tasmanian wine, so maybe when Panama's allowed to open up and resume wine sales, you'll be able to find one. Okay, yeah.
Jason asked on the Q&A, he asked what grape variety is most popular in Australia. I think we'd have to say right now it would be it'd be Shiraz, because that's the most planted variety. Period's the most planted red variety, but it's also the most planted variety. Of the 135,000 hectares of vineyard land in Australia, 44,000 hectares Shiraz. So it's our most planted variety, and I would argue our most popular. Right. There's other things in Australia that are really starting to emerge, but there's no question it would be Shiraz, followed by Chardonnay, followed by Cabernet at this particular stage.
Yeah.
Riesling, long history. I'm a huge fan of Riesling in general, and we've had a long history of it in Australia. And there was a period of time where it was more planted than Chardonnay back in the 80s, but that's certainly not the case now. Still suffering a little bit from the general problems that Riesling Riesling has globally, which we've been saying. I've been in the trade for a long time. We've been saying, when's Riesling? When's everyone going to get excited about Riesling? And it sort of happened a bit, but it's been an ongoing thing. I think the history in Australia has evolved. It's been around for a long time. But one of the things that has always been sort of fairly consistent, certainly for the last several decades, is that the style is dry. So certainly try that wine. We'll have a bit more of a chat about Riesling, but try that wine and you'll kind of see what I mean.
So for anybody tasting along, go ahead and open your Riesling and thank us for not requiring the wine key for the second wine in a row. It's just such an easy thing to do. So we are huge fans of this wine. We use it for our WSET classes because it shows such great typicity for a very refreshing dry style. So a lot of times we get students who say, like, I don't know how to purchase a Riesling. I'm always afraid it's going to be sweet.
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah,
this is the total opposite of that. So yeah, feel free to go ahead and pour your Riesling and start exploring it. Get familiar with the nose while Mark talks about it.
I used to explain to students, I'd start my WSET classes or any class I was doing the very first level, and I'd always say to the students, okay, one thing you need to understand, if you don't like Riesling by the end of the program, you will not only fail this program, but you won't be successful in life. And they thought I was serious, but of course I wasn't. Just wanted people to go, Riesling, we hate Riesling. But, and if sometimes I've been at trade shows or consumer shows, and we don't do a lot of that, but if this is ever on the table, people, you say to someone, try this. Oh no, I don't like Riesling. Okay, well, you're not getting to try anything else at this table until you try that. They will come back and drink that all night long, because it's just this beautiful expression of, I think the way to get people into Riesling is a wine like this, not just because it's Australian, but it's just that it's not showing sweetness, but it's got that beautiful, vibrant acidity. There's lovely fruit there that's extremely charming, but it finishes dry, which is like, wow, what else do you want? It's an absolutely delicious and a perfect example of what youthful dry Riesling can show, because it's a little bit soft around the edges. It's not this really searing high and hard acidity. It's very easy to drink and lovely. So I don't know if they know how many people have got it, but I'd love to, anyway, as we keep going through this, if you want to make a comment about it, I'd be curious to see what you think, because I think it's a wonderful transition wine to get people to think. I've always said, what's the, all the people that are fascinated with New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, how difficult a transition is to come and try something like this from New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Lower in alcohol, still got that lovely, vibrant, citrusy quality. What's the problem with it? It says Riesling. So it's still a bit of a barrier for people.
That's a scary word, exactly. Yeah, and I guess it's kind of like the hand sell, like you said at the trade shows. People have to be almost tricked into, or
forced into it.
And then a whole new world has been opened. And we were just talking about that in class this morning. You can't say I don't like Chardonnay. I mean, you can, but I think you just haven't had the right one, and the same applies to Riesling. So unfortunately, people have had that unfortunate experience of maybe drinking something a little bit on the entry level or made without love, less expensive, and residual sugar.
Totally.
They weren't expecting.
Totally.
And it's the total opposite of that.
Yeah. So the different areas, this is from Eden Valley. There's a few different areas. Probably the more famous area in Australia for Riesling would be Clare. But right here, these two here, if you remember nothing else about Riesling in Australia, remember these two areas here, the wine that we've got there, but also this. There's lots of other great areas, but they're probably the most noted. And I think that lemon lime, sort of lime zest sort of quality, there's a little bit of an overlay of almost a tropical fruit flavor in this as well, but it is, you know, very much a persistent lemon lime thing, which I think is really, really cool. But Eden Valley, and again, altitude and cooler evenings, same here in Eden Valley. This is actually where it's from. It's in Barossa Valley and Eden Valley are actually under the Barossa GI. They're actually the same, one and the same, you know, they're involved in the same region, but Eden Valley is the elevated portion of what's known as the Barossa zone. But this, these are the specifics about the wine. I'll show you a picture of the state. This is a beautiful, this was originally planted in 1847 and went into disuse, and the Robert Hill Smith's grandfather bought the vineyard in the 60s, planted it all to Riesling in the 60s, which is now called the Pewsey clone, probably was a German clone originally, but they went through some little trial and error with some other varieties, but it's essentially all Riesling again now. The old vineyard is the old section is where they do the contours, separate bottling, but this comes from the rest of the property. You can see it's been biodynamically farmed. There's some good practices in the vineyard here since 2011. And the thing I do love about Riesling in general and wines like this is there are no winemaking artifices here. You know, it is you pick the fruit, you ferment it, you put it in a bottle. If there are any sort of blemishes and sort of problems with the wine, you're going to see them. So what you get on the vine is what you're going to get in the bottle here. There's no oak aging. There's no techniques used to sort of enhance or ameliorate the qualities of the wine. It's just pure Riesling, you know, vibrancy and fruit, and it's lovely stuff.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly, you know, what this is here. In the previous slide, the way that your description of the style from Eden Valley was spot on with the citrus, lemon, lime. It's very like little hints of floral and that tropical note that would be just fresh tropical fruit. You know, it's not the kind that's overripe or.
Yeah, there's almost a slight, I don't know if you ever had guava. You get guavas down in Florida, but there's almost a slight, because there's a bit of a tartness to guava or passion fruit even, and you get that tropical note, but it's still got acidity, and I love that. I think that's a really charming quality. This is the site, though. It's a beautiful site, and I love this picture. I took this picture a few years ago simply because I think it speaks to, number one, this site. This site's sitting at about there's different elevations within the site, probably about 400 meters above sea level. But in the background there, you get an idea of it's quite exposed and quite rocky. It's quite a cool spot here. And I have taken perverse pleasure over the years, taking master sommeliers and other people in the trade, and we'll be standing up here. And I don't tell them to not bring a jacket. I just don't tell them anything. And they're sitting there freezing their butts off up there going, okay, I understand Riesling up here. Because you're on the Barossa Valley floor and it's quite a bit warmer. And you go up into Eden and you go, wow, it's really cold up here. Like, there you go. This is why Riesling works. And so
That's amazing. So if you were to say take a drive from, you know, the lowest elevations in Barossa and go up to this vineyard, about how long might it take?
This vineyard, it's amazing because this vineyard would be a 20-minute drive out of Anguston, maybe 15-20-minute drive out of Anguston, which is one of the towns in the Barossa itself. So it's a decent drive out of there, but it's quite remarkable because it's, you know, it was planted originally in 1847. It was in the middle of nowhere then, you can imagine. It's still kind of in the middle of nowhere now. So it's just kind of out there on the southern part of the Eden Valley. So it's about a 20-minute drive, and you're looking at, the Barossa Valley floor sits about 200 meters, and then this is at 550. So it's going up to 300, pushing 400 meters.
Significant. So, okay. Yeah. So the idea that somebody hiked up there, planted their vines, and tended them, showed they really wanted that Riesling. You know, not an accidental product in any way.
No, and I love it. This has been now Riesling, only Riesling since the 60s, and it's just going from, and I love hearing stories about, because, you know, when I first tried this, like, man, this should be on by the glass everywhere. It's so delicious. And to then hear you guys saying, oh, this is one of our favorites, we use it all the time. I love it. I love hearing that, because that's, you know, it's exactly, you want to understand classic dry Australian Riesling. This is it. This is a beautiful example. And I like the fact that sometimes, you know, you can get young dry Riesling that's just a little bit sort of searing and a bit hard and not charming. They'll become delicious in a few years, but this is lip smacking delicious from the get-go, and you don't, you know, it's not about waiting around, it's about drinking, you know?
No, I mean, 2008, it's perfect right now. We do get a lot of questions from students, especially if they're like a little bit newer, they love wine, but they're getting into it. They always want to know, you know, how long can I age this wine? Of course, not all wines are meant to be aged, and for a young Riesling that's showing amazingly now, if somebody wanted to hold on to this for a few years, is it worth?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is 2018. I've had versions of this because they've been, Pewsey actually did screw cap trials in the 70s. So I've had some of these wines going back, and they're amazing. I think the beautiful thing about, one of the things you need for age worthiness in white wines, you need acidity, you need structured acidity. You have to have the commensurate amount of concentration of fruit and what have you. This is a wine that's so unbelievably delicious. Now, you could happily age that for 5 to 10 years and be quite surprised at the quality and character. However, I do think where one of the stumbling blocks for Riesling has been for people is when you do age it, it picks up all these lovely qualities that, you know, we go, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. It's got these sort of petrol-y qualities and these lovely, or sometimes you get an almost creme brulee quality to it. But you give that to the average consumer for the first time in a Riesling, they're going to go, what's wrong with you people? I don't like this at all. You know,
They may think the wine has gone off. Yeah, absolutely. That's a very, very good point. Yeah, if you try to give somebody who's just trying to learn to love Riesling and you want them to have a good first experience, maybe stick with the younger one.
Totally, yeah, totally agree. But no, age worthiness here, you can, yeah, if you can keep your hands off it, but put it in the cellar for, you know, get a case of it. It's not super expensive, and try and hang on to a bottle each year, and just sort of see how it goes and see how it ages. But I love wines like this because, I mean, they're so food friendly. But I don't know, maybe this is just me, but sometimes when I'm trying to decide what wine I'm going to have for dinner, I'd like to have a glass of this while I'm deciding what I'm going to have for dinner. You know, it's like a perfect contemplation wine. It's like, oh, what am I going to have for dinner? So I love it. I think it's a totally delicious wine, aperitif wine.
I'm going to start doing that more now. Yeah, I've had this wine at home, and since I've been, you know, under the lockdown, I think this is the 4th bottle that I've opened of just this. So
it's been good for, that's one thing about the lockdown. It's been good for the wine drinking stamina.
Yeah. I think we could all probably attest to that. And I see it. So Nada made a comment that she was convinced she didn't like Riesling until now. So that's
Who's this?
exactly Nada, one of our students. She took the WSET level 1, and yeah. So just to, you know, kind of circle back to what you had said, Mark, is if you do like things like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc and you want to venture out, you can go to the Riesling, you know, and eat in
Totally agree.
And you have everything that you would be looking for. It's refreshing, variations of fruits, and the acidity here is not that searing, kind of, you know, make you step back.
No, it's refreshing. It's mouth-watering. It's, you know, it's citrusy. Makes you want to have more. No, I love it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
just
cool.
perfect wine. Yeah, good. Anybody else thoughts on the Riesling? I know we have more than just Nada sipping along at home. So let us know what you think if you've opened it. I know some people aren't opening all 3 bottles, maybe if they can.
No, understood though. John also said, what do they think of Hardy's Riesling? I haven't had their ones. They've always made there was a different cuvee, and I can't think of the name of it, but Hardy's was one of the famous names in wine in Australia for many years. Bought out by some bigger companies, but historically they've always made some good Riesling. I haven't had them in a few years though, John, so sorry I can't be a bit more expressive on that specific wines, but cool. All right, where are we at here? Next, well, I'm glad people are liking it. I'm glad that there's a convert to Riesling in the group. So yeah, that's fun. Really good stuff. Yeah, we do this with a lot of our friends too, because we're always pushing these sorts of wines. So you've got to try this, and like, oh, that's amazing. And just there's nothing to dislike about it necessarily. It's just such an easy wine to drink. One of my pet you know, things right now in Australia is what's been happening with Grenache. It was a sort of talk a bit about a rebirth, but it's one of the original varieties that was planted in Australia. It was really suited to the Australian climate, still is, and now people are starting to understand the inherent qualities. I think one of the issues with Grenache is that its abilities, this sort of workhorse sort of nature of it. It's wonderful for blends. It's excellent for fortifies. It became the sort of sort of that sort of in the shadows. Yep. It'll fix a blend. We like it in the blends of different reds. Excellent for, you know, its sugar production, therefore great for full-bodied alcoholic wines. But the reality is that understanding how to grow Grenache and make varietal wine out of it has been an amazing evolution in the last 15 years. And there's a producer in Barossa calls it warm climate Pinot. And I thought initially that was a really weird thing. And actually, when you start tasting these new examples, you go, no, there is a correspondence here in a way. There's this, it's a thin-skinned variety. It's beautiful in its aromatics. The structures are quite different, but if you can get to see the full spectrum of what Grenache is capable of producing, it's not just about big, concentrated, full-bodied and alcoholic wines, which we see in parts of the world, including Australia. Pick it earlier, use it, treat it a bit like Pinot, using a bit of whole cluster and no new oak. And it's like, wow, there's these beautiful aromatic and perfumed wines that are really quite shocking for people initially. And we're seeing this is not just an Aussie thing. I've had a couple of Spanish ones recently where I'm going, yeah, this is where we need to be heading. So I love good Grenache, but it can be heavy. And what we don't like about Grenache is whether it be a poor example of Southern Rhone or Southern France or a Grenache from Spain or Australia, soft, candied, overcropped, call it candy water. We call them lollies in Australia. So it's a lolly water in Australia. And it's like, oh, that's not much fun. It's cloying and not fun to drink. But if you get that sort of acidity and the structure all worked out, it's a beautiful, beautiful variety. And this varietal, not being part of a blend only, it's just this single varietal Grenache is a really lovely thing and a new evolution for Australia. Some of the great old vines exist in Barossa Valley and McLaren Vale. There's other areas, but again, if you're thinking varietal Grenache right now, think Barossa and think McLaren Vale. And McLaren Vale has really been leading the charge in terms of being able to produce these lovely aromatic and perfumed medium-bodied wines. It can be full-bodied. Old school wines can be quite full-bodied, but love them. Grown in sand, and yeah, it's lovely stuff.
Yeah, they're obviously, well, I don't want to say obviously, I have seen that they are moving in a more elegant direction as well. It's once you kind of understand how to control it, and that like warm climate Pinot description is very good.
It's not as silly as it seems. I initially thought it was really stupid, but it's like, oh, how dare you talk about Pinot like that? But it's like, it's not. There's a correspondence, and I actually really like it. I think it's a really cool way to look at things. And there's actually a really cool story. I met, it's an American story, actually. I'll just quickly do it. There's a master sommelier called Richard Betts, who many years ago got quite excited about Grenache. And the way he quickly tells the story, because he's now making a lovely, he just bought a vineyard planted in 1867 originally, just bought this vineyard, sold shares in a Burgundy vineyard that he had to buy a vineyard in Barossa so he can do his own domain bottled Grenache. It's a really cool story. But he was really captivated by Grenache in general, and he went around the world to different parts of, where, Grenache, went to, Sardinia, went to Spain, he went to southern France, he ended up in Barossa going, yeah, old bushvine Barossa Grenache. And just a few years ago, and he's now making one you see in the market here called Suzette. Yeah, it's definitely a premium wine, but lovely guy, and it just, wow, really cool story about just sort of, what he wants to do with what his is like domain bottled and domain produced Barossa Shiraz, and he's replanting, but he's not planting on trellising. He's doing old school bushvine replanting in some of the, and his original site was planted in 1867. So he's, it's pretty exciting stuff. So there's a renaissance, a real rebirth and of interest in this. And I can tell you right now, the styles that are being produced are also being, some of this speaks a little bit to the regions themselves. When you're in Barossa and you're in McLaren Vale, there are times of the year where you want big full-bodied wines, but not always. You want these lighter, fresher. I mean, think about it. I was in Chardonnay 2 years ago. There was a lot of big alcoholic wines there. I love them. I don't want to drink them all the time. So this refreshment thing, I think, is a really important piece of the puzzle. You can have a lighter, more medium-bodied style Grenache at different times of the year. So
right.
Cool.
Yeah, you don't always need a 14.5% full body wine.
Yeah.
Not if you want to last the whole night.
Yeah. So someone said, "Oh, I don't like those big alcoholic wines." Well, I said, "You don't actually have to drink the whole bottle. You have to. You can stop." So a quick thing, I just wanted to throw that in there, even if it's a little bit harder to get Grenache. I just think it's a super cool story and something that you should source out and have a look at.
Yeah, and even
of course, the legend. Sorry, go ahead.
For people that maybe can't find or are having some issues, like I'm thinking of Emily and Jonathan in Pittsburgh having trouble finding any Australian wines, and we talked a little bit about GSM blends.
Yes,
that's one of my favorite combinations, and it's the Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre, Mataro also is what it's called in Australia. So for people that maybe want to have that experience but can't find single varietal Grenache, I saw that you alluded to that in the past slide, and those are much easier to find generally, don't have to be expensive, and they're very, I think they're very friendly wines.
Totally
Not
agree.
because they're simple, but because they're delicious and people find them, great right off the bat. So,
yeah, no, I'm glad I skipped over that, but I shouldn't have, because I'm so excited about varietal Grenache. But the GSMs are classics. I mean, prior to the varietal labeling sort of fascination that the world has had, and Australia included, classic dry red wine in Australia out of the Barossa, that was it. It was that blend in various forms, Grenache, those three, the sort of the triumvirate of those varieties. That was the deal. So. But onto Shiraz, which is, what is without a doubt, this is the, our sort of benchmark variety. It's our heritage variety, if you like. Not that we would term it that way necessarily. But I think it's fair to suggest that over the years, a little bit of boredom had crept in. I think people got a bit tired of Shiraz and wanted to see what else was new in Australia. And I think what we're seeing now is that people have moved away from Shiraz, they've been trying other things, and now there's this real interest in some of the more fascinating seminars I've been doing recently, and I'm doing one for the Second City Soms in Chicago, and I've done something for another. It's all about Shiraz. They want to look at that regional Shiraz now. They want to go back and see the different expressions. And I think the funny thing is that this is I often put a slide up, and I should have done it today, and I said, what's wrong with this picture? And I'll put American Cabernet, French Pinot, Australian Shiraz. And what's wrong with that is that nobody says American Cabernet. They say Napa or California. Nobody says, I love French Pinot, or rarely. They go to a place. And yet with Australia, we say, we love Australian Shiraz. What does that even mean? It's grown in 65 different regions, all of which have different soils for the most part, different climates, elevation. So how can it all be the same? Unfortunately, it's been promoted through certain brands as being, hey, this is an easy drinking style. And I do like the fact that people have this idea of like, I love Shiraz, I love it. It gets people drinking wine in general, but certainly Australian wine. But it doesn't do it a service when we don't understand. I mean, I loved when I was a young sommelier, I was fascinated by Côte Rôtie and the expression that Syrah can have in that area, and how different it was from Gros Hermitage and from Hermitage. Yet we're not talking about that in Australia, and not, at least not enough. If you get access to and can put in front of you the various expressions of Shiraz that exist in Australia, there's no other country or region on the planet that can do with that variety what we can, yet nobody knows it. It's just like, yep, love Australian Shiraz. So I think the important thing here is to look at cool climate, warm climate, and see what's actually out there, because it is quite an astonishing, add to that the oldest vine on the planet, and you've got a real, it's a legend. It's a legendary variety for us. And yet I think, we're starting to see the bit more interest back in it again, which I think is wonderful. Generally speaking, it's not easy to sort of separate it into, like, oh, well, explain the differences. So I tend to go, okay, you've got your commercial styles of Shiraz, which is just soft and fruity and easy drinking. They've not really come from anywhere specific. They're sort of broad acre farming and fun, easy, not to be dismissed. I think those styles of wine are great. They're, Cabernets from Central Valley in California, same sort of deal. But what I try and look at is that, okay, what are the cooler climate expressions looking like, and what does warmer climate, and how we can separate them into those two, if you like. So generally speaking, from say places like Barossa and McLaren Vale, you're getting bolder flavors, juicy, jammy, dark fruits, quite ripe tannins, and just more body, more extract, and more concentration, even though there's some variation within there. Cooler climate, more food friendly, medium bodied, and you're getting to a bit more, you tend a bit more towards those red fruits like raspberry and sometimes cherry, and they're more savory sorts of things that you see arguably in parts of the Rhone Valley and other parts of the world, where they're more medium bodied and red fruited and savory. And I think that's kind of cool. You get the youthful qualities of those rich dark fruits, and then I think Shiraz ages beautifully, showing some of those nice sort of savory, warm, sort of spicy, licoricey and earthy characters. And I think it's a very versatile and really cool variety. And unfortunately, we need to spend some more time exploring those regional expressions. I'll have a look at the main regions, and we'll talk specifically about the wine you've got. I wasn't able to get a bottle, but I certainly know that wine well. Sitting just around here, I mean, sorry, say it again.
I said, I'll tell you all about it.
Awesome. Barossa, what we're looking at with Barossa, honestly, I mean, I don't like saying it's like our Napa Valley, but I'm trying to think of, because actually Hunter Valley would be closer to Napa Valley simply in the sense that it's close to the big major city and you get a lot of tourist traffic there. But our most famous region, without a doubt, one of the more exported regionally specific wines has to be Barossa Shiraz. And so I think it's a really significant thing for us. Generally speaking, people think of Barossa Shiraz and they're big, bold, full-bodied, and earthy, and quite alcoholic. Those exist, but there's variation within Barossa, and I think you cannot get away from the fact that it is ultimately a warm climate region. You know, Châteauneuf-du-Pape, Priorat, and other areas around the world, they're warm, but that doesn't exclude the wines from having this beautiful, precisely ripe fruit and a freshness and vibrancy that I think is really important and has been extracted nowadays from careful vineyard management and not getting sort of really overripe fruit. And I think what you should be trying in that particular wine, I think you're starting to see that shift in the 2015 vintage. I thought Barossa went through a bit of a shift, maybe even a bit earlier than that. But you're going to get warm, bold flavors as opposed to, maybe something from Grampians or even Adelaide Hills, where it's more moderate and those spicy sort of characteristics that we see in Shiraz, that peppery character starts to come through. But yes, I think what you'll find in this particular wine, Peter Lehman, who was a legend he passed away a few years ago. He was a legend in the Barossa Valley. He was one of those pioneers that back in the 80s, when people were being paid to pull out old vines, him, the guy from Rockford, and a few other the producers, the old guys, went around to these German growers, because a lot of the families of generational family growers came from Germany. He was going around and paying them not to pull these vines out, even though he couldn't do anything with this fruit, because he knew the market was really bad in the early 80s. But they just said, no, don't. These old vines are our legacy. These are treasure troves. We'll buy the fruit from you. We'll try and do something with it, but we can't pay you a whole bunch, but keep them in the ground. We promise you these are going to be valuable. And so he was a guy with a lot of vision. So I had a lot of time for Peter Lehman. And always a fan of that wine because it's not super expensive, and I think it just gives you this beautifully typical Barossa character. But I'd love to see what you think, Nicole, and then I'll tell you what I was thinking before I could even open the bottle.
Yeah, so it's exactly what I would hope for and expect. There's lots of really, like you put here, bursting with flavor and character. I like that kind of bursting because it's very fragrant right out of the glass with the dark fruits that I expect. They're very ripe, not quite as jammy as some of the other examples from Barossa Valley that I've tried. So
cool.
Plenty of ripeness, and there's the spice here, a little bit of that black pepper, and a little hint of licorice as well. So there's a diversity in the spice notes, but I'm also getting a little bit of the meat notes, those gamey notes that I like in more cool. with like that moderate climate Syrah, and not so much with the Barossa Valley Shiraz. So it's got a little bit of everything.
Cool. No, that's nice. And I think what we've started to see more and more in general in Australia, but certainly Barossa Shiraz is a great place to sort of discuss this, is that I think that there's no question in a warmer, and I was a gentleman from Rockford Winery. We don't see the wines here, unfortunately. He just said something really simple and so obvious. He said, look, poorly made wines in cool climates are green and stemmy and unripe. Poorly made wines in the warmer climates, they're overripe. And he said, they're overripe, they're jammy, they lack their sort of precision and their beauty. And he said, my job is to manage this. We don't have a problem with ripeness, but I have to manage that ripeness. Like, very simple. It is a really simple way to look at it, and he just articulated it beautifully. And I think a lot of that is to do with picking times and vineyard management and how to sort of work with shading. And I mean, it's a warm climate region, and you have to manage that warmth. And beautifully made wines in the Barossa show just what you said there, which is there's richness, there's ripeness, but it doesn't have to be heavy. It doesn't have to be sort of over the top. There's warmth and there's comfort in the wine, but there's precise fruit in there. And I think that's kind of cool. I wish I could taste that now. Tempted to open this one now, but I don't know.
And then we'll really all be wishing we were swapping places all over. But yeah, and so that's really a testament to the obvious care and attention to making sure that the grapes didn't get overly ripe, because in the mouth as well, we always expect these very full body wines, and the body is there, but it has that elegance. And for anybody that might not really get, like, what does it mean when a wine is elegant? I kind of just think of it as a balanced powerfulness. So you have something that's like, I'm a big fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers, always have been. I'm from Pittsburgh. Anybody who has been to Pittsburgh would know what I'm talking about. But there was a very famous football player called Lynn Swann, very tall, powerful, built, muscular man who also practiced ballet. And he ended up being a very talented ballerina because his job was to kind of leap and make these daring, graceful catches. And that's kind of what wines like that bring to mind, is they've got power and elegance, just balanced.
Oh, wow, what a lovely analogy. That's awesome. I'm going to steal that, by the way.
Please
I'm going to use it. I will give you credit. I like that. That's awesome. Because that'll make people think I know more about America than I do when I'm talking about these ones. But that's kind of cool, though. I love that. That's a really nice way to look at it. That's awesome. And I do think that is I do think that that's an interesting way to look at it, because I do think there's a tightrope that the great wines of the world, and look, Peter Lehman's that portrait Shiraz, that's not aiming to be one of the great Barossa Shirazes, but I do think about that in the great wines of the world, be it cool climate, warm climate, whatever. There's a tightrope that the wines walk a little bit. It's like, having that intensity and power without being over the top or being one way or another, and you just walk right down that fine sort of line of balance. And I think it's an important thing. And, I hear people talking about it, and it's not just about Barossa, but I hear it about California and other places. Oh, I don't like these big alcoholic wines, which is fine. You don't have to. But just because something is a big, full-bodied and alcoholic doesn't mean it's not balanced. And I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle I had to learn, is that balance, a couple of things. Number one, balance is about having, if you've got richness and high alcohol, if you've got the fruit and the extract and the tannins and all sorts of other components, the wine can be balanced. So I think it's important to remember that tightrope has to be walked. And yeah, that's cool. Well, good. I'm glad. I don't know if anyone else is trying the wine, but yeah, by all means, jump in and say a few things. But yeah, classic example of an affordable but varietally, interesting and regionally expressive. And I always get this. I don't know if it's coming through your wine there, but there's something. I pick it up in Grenache, Mourvèdre, and a lot of the red varieties. There is a Barossaness to my mind, and the way people say, well, what do you mean by that? I don't 100% know, but it's almost like a warm, spicy, earthy quality that I think comes through. And to me, that's the Barossaness. And I love that we are also varietally obsessed, but honestly, I wish we started to do a little bit more of how they've done in other countries, which you talk about. Doesn't matter what the wine's made out of, there's this Barossa quality that's coming through. And that's why I like sometimes the GSM blends, because I get Barossaness in them. And I love that. Barossaness isn't a word, I just made it up. But
no, I understood exactly what you meant. And I can see what you mean too, because going back, it's kind of like a cardamom or a spice box.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Really, you don't always find it's either that black pepper or the licorice, but this is more than just like, sweet or savory. It's got a little bit of everything. It's quite like a little bit exotic, if you will.
Cool. Nice. Good. I'm glad that wine's showing well today. That's cool. That's awesome.
Beautiful. I'm pretty sure.
So yeah, that's
sorry, taking a little home. She's just asking about actually, we just have a couple quick questions I want to catch up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Please. Yeah, no, I've been gabbling on too much, please.
No, not at all. Carlos was interested, like from your personal, perspective and opinion, what is your favorite wine region for reds, whether it be Shiraz or GSM? So do you have a particular region that you really prefer when grabbing a red?
Oh, okay. Politically, I have to say in my role, I love all regions equally.
Okay. Off the record,
some more meekly. Okay, no, it's fine. No, I do have the areas. I love what's happening with quote unquote modern Barossa, and that is this capturing of that warmth of the region, but taming it and making it sort of, there's still freshness and along with that body. I do like that. And there's some producers doing beautiful stuff. I think one of the truly great wines, never mind the fact that Shiraz, never mind the fact that it's from Australia, but one of the great wines on the planet is a wine from Henschke, who's up in the Eden Valley. And it's, well, Hill of Grace it would be, but who get to try that. But they make a wine called Mount Edelstone. And it was planted in 1912. I will run down in 2 seconds and grab a bottle and show it to you guys, because I think it is one of the great single vineyard wines on the planet. Never mind one of the greatest, most unique expressions of Shiraz on the planet. I'm going to quickly grab a bottle just to show it to you, because I think it's very cool. Excuse me.
And then, Daria, I know you asked about a slide for the one. I'm fairly positive he does have one coming up. So we'll talk a little bit more about this wine specifically. And Mary had also asked about having access to the slides. And so most, as Mark said at the beginning of the presentation, most of this information was gleaned from their, Discover Australia. You can go to wineaustralia.com for the website, and pretty much everything is there, and it's free. You can use it. So definitely go and take advantage of that.
So here it is. So to answer your question in a long-winded fashion, this is it. Henschke, one of the great 7 generations now, 6 generations. Growers. This wine was first made as a single vineyard wine in the 50s, which was not conventional wisdom back then. So there was some foresight and vision there. But it's also just this wonderfully unique expression. And I think push comes to shove, that might be one of my favorite. Shiraz. Yeah, that would be one of them. But I think just one of the great wines in the world, period.
Mark, I just want to type it in the chat box. Again, the producer, you said it's a single vineyard. I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing it on the picture. I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay. So it is Henschke, Mount Edelston. So that's Edelstone. That's the Mount Edelston vineyard. So it's in the Eden Valley. So look it up, buy it. Yeah, I think it's one of the, it's not a cheap wine, unfortunately, but it's, planted in 1912. It's 100 and something year old vineyard.
Yeah.
Magic stuff. Really, really cool stuff.
So
that would be it. Other parts, there is another one called Clonakilla, which is from Canberra district, this area here. There's an elegance and spice and perfume that when I first tried that, I thought, wow, that is as good a Côte Rôtie as I've ever had. And it wasn't Côte Rôtie, and it was this. So I do like that. And I really like what's happening in cool areas like Yarra Valley right now, even though it's known for Pinot. There's some very, very interesting Shiraz coming out of Yarra Valley, and often being labeled Syrah as a defining point.
Yeah. So I think one way you could look at this is maybe just ask yourself what kind of wine you're in the mood for. If you want, overly ripe, bold, or if you want it to be a little bit more savory, you could always come back and refer to the slide and then go to that region.
Perfect. Yeah, you can. Yeah, just look, source those out and have a look at them. Yeah, for sure. Hopefully that answered. Was it Carlos that asked that question? Hopefully that answers.
Yeah, I think so. He said, yeah, thanks. Good. And then somebody had just asked about a slide for the Peter Lehman wine itself, which I'm sure is coming next. I guess she wanted to see the tech sheet for Peter Lehman. If you had it on the next slide.
Yeah, I had trouble finding the tech sheet for this wine actually. So I know a couple of the bits and pieces. There wasn't a lot of detailed. But Peter Lehman went through, got purchased by a different company, and they've sort of been in and out of the market recently. So actually getting updated info. But generally speaking, I know that this particular wine is sourced from multiple multiple vineyard sites across the region. Fermentation in stainless steel, it spends about 12 months in French and American hogsheads, which are the 300-liter barrels, slightly bigger than the ones. Yeah, and I couldn't get any other tech information, but I think it's the idea here is about the expression of Barossa as opposed to a single site. So yeah.
And from what you said, it really is spot on. So
awesome, cool. And I thought, look, I'm just mindful of time right now, so we've managed to get through all this, and I don't want to sort of carry on. Did I get all the questions? Are there any additional questions?
There was just really quick ones, and I think we could kind of just knock them out really quickly. One was best food and wine pairing for this style of wine, Shiraz. I mean, you can a good and that was Jesus, I think, that asked it. A good rule of thumb is to kind of match the intensity of the wine with the intensity of food. Because otherwise there aren't too many strict rules, but maybe you have some suggestions.
Yeah, I mean Australia's a country eats a lot of lamb. Now that's not something that happens in the US for some reason. People don't like lamb as much, but I do think that I like lamb and Cabernet because I do think it's a wonderful combination. But I've had many extraordinarily good dishes, lamb-based dishes. I've actually had Shiraz with kangaroo. Kangaroo is quite tasty. It's a very lean meat, but I think any kind of red meat and certainly anything grilled, because we call it barbecuing in Australia, but it's not really barbecuing. We didn't get that one right. You guys got it right. It's grilling is what we do in Australia. But we do a lot of grilling in Australia, and I think a lot of steak and lamb would be a really great combination here. But I also think there's a savory note here that I think works really, really well with stews and stewed meats as well. I think it'd be great. Yeah,
that makes sense. That kind of powerful meets powerful, or not even powerful, but just that level of flavor intensity would be well matched with that.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
Good. If there's any other questions, maybe give a quick type in the chat. But as Mark mentioned, this information is out there. You know, that's part of what, you know, his job is, to kind of promote this information, so that we now understand
Absolutely.
how fantastic and diverse the wines are. Oh, and it's so beautiful. And you know where to get them now, you know, with 305. And if you have, you know, more questions, if you go to bed and you think of something, contact me. I'll be happy to, you know, communicate with Mark, and definitely visit their education resources, because what a great thing to have it for free. So
yeah, and I'll just do quickly show you through some. We were going to go through Cabernet, but this has been the rest of the presentation, and then I've got some slides in there on the various regions with a few things. But like I say, you can just go and you can get this presentation from you. But also, all of this exists in the various things. But I'm happy to, as you said, Nicole, you know, forward me any questions via my email, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions. But yeah, great. I'm glad we had some Riesling converts tonight. Yes,
yes,
my job has been done.
Such a victory. Yeah, and if people, you know, love it, and look how much, you know, we couldn't even cover. Obviously, we're not going to get through the whole of Australia in an hour and a half, but you know, we would love to, you know, maybe Mark, you and I chat, and we do an extension.
Happy to come back, and we can look at some other things. Yeah, no, happy to do it.
Good. Yeah, again, sharing is caring. Thanks, Mark. Indeed. Yeah, all kinds of great stuff here today. So I can't thank you enough, Mark, for you just have this fantastic grasp of the region, and not the region, all of the regions. Thank you for
Thank you. No, thank you guys. Absolute pleasure. Really, really cool. I look forward to sort of catching up with you, and it'd be nice one of these days when we get back to normal. I'll come down and do a class at your school. That'd be even better fun.
Everybody hear that? They all heard that. They're going to hold you to it.
Happy to be held to it. Any excuse to be down in Florida, I'm happy to go.
All right. So, yes.
Awesome, guys. Thank you very much.
Hope you learned a lot. Have a fantastic day. Take care.
Bye, thanks, guys.
Cheers.